It is a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1877, and the gas lamps along Evelina Road, Peckham, are throwing their usual pale orange light at the brick terraces. Inside number 5, a dinner party is in full swing. There is roast mutton, there is laughter. The neighbours, a solicitor's clerk, a draper's wife, a retired school teacher, are leaning forward in their chairs, because the man standing by the fireplace is extraordinary. He is not young, he is not handsome. He is a small, wiry man in his mid-40s with a dark beard, a slight limp, and hands that seem too large for his body. But when he draws the bow across the strings, something happens to the room. Conversations stop. Glasses are set down. The school teacher will describe this moment in her diary the following morning, calling him the most gifted amateur I have ever heard. His name, he has told them, is John Ward. He is a picture frame dealer. He is a gentleman. He has lived among them for almost a year, and they think they know him. They do not know that 2 months ago, he shot a man at close range on a doorstep in Sheffield. They do not know that 12 months before that, he killed a police constable in Manchester, and that another man is currently sitting in a prison cell, serving a life sentence for that murder. They do not know any of this. He finishes the piece, the room applauds. He gives a small, courtly bow, and he sits back down among them, picks up his wineglass and smiles. To understand Charles Peace, you need to understand the particular texture of the world he operated in, because he didn't just commit crimes in the Victorian era. He understood it, he read it, he used it. By the mid-1870s, London was the largest city on earth. 4 million people packed into terraces, courts, and lodging houses, each neighbourhood a different ecosystem of class and expectation. In Peckham and Blackheath, the suburbs where Peace would eventually make his home, a respectable appearance was almost a legal document. If you rented a decent house, kept a tidy garden, attended church on Sunday, and did not trouble your neighbours, nobody asked questions. The suburbs were built on the shared agreement not to look too closely. Scotland Yard, meanwhile, was in the middle of a painful period of reform. The Detective Department, later to become the Criminal Investigation Department, the CID, in 1878, the very year of Peace's arrest, was small, undermanned, and operating with no national fingerprint database, no photographs shared between forces, and almost no formal communication between the Sheffield Constabulary and the Metropolitan Police. A wanted man from Yorkshire could vanish into London and become, for all practical purposes, a different person. The system was not designed to catch someone like Charles Peace. It was designed to catch someone who stayed still. The newspapers were something else entirely. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph, the Leeds Mercury, the Illustrated Police News. These were the mass media of their moment, and Victorian readers devoured crime coverage with an appetite that would feel familiar to anyone with a true crime podcast in their ears today. When Peace was eventually caught, the coverage was extraordinary. His case sold papers from Sheffield to Sydney. The Illustrated Police News ran full-page engravings of his face, his disguises, his escape attempt from the train. The public already knew his name before the trial began. One vivid detail. In 1876, a first-class railway ticket from Sheffield to London cost approximately 14 shillings. That is 2 weeks' wages for a labourer. Peace, who had stripped dozens of houses in Sheffield of their silver and jewellery, could afford it comfortably. Crime, for a man of his skill and ambition, paid remarkably well. Here is what the neighbours knew about John Ward of Evelina Road, Peckham. He was a self-made man, a picture-frame dealer who had come from the north with a modest inheritance and a love of music. He was unfailingly polite. He called the women madam and tipped his hat on the street. He kept his small front garden immaculately. He was, by the account of nearly everyone who met him in London, genuinely charming, not in a slick or calculated way, but with the easy warmth of a man who had learned to read rooms. He played violin. He played very well. Contemporary accounts describe him performing at Neighbours' social evenings, at church fundraisers, at small informal concerts. His musicianship was not the dabbling of a hobbyist. Peace had studied the violin with real seriousness from boyhood, and those who heard him in the late 1870s describe his playing as technically accomplished and emotionally expressive. The Sheffield newspaper that would later print his obituary would call him a musician of genuine gifts wasted entirely. He also attended church. St. John's in Blackheath, where he eventually moved, had a congregation of precisely the kind of aspirational middle-class families that Peace understood and inhabited so naturally. He sat in his pew. He bowed his head. He perhaps even meant some of it. We will return to that question later. What the neighbours did not see was the second life running in parallel. On certain nights, the picture-frame dealer was elsewhere. He was moving through the dark back gardens of South London, with a bag of tools and a practiced, silent efficiency that reflected 30 years of criminal experience. He operated alone. He was extraordinarily careful. He favoured large, detached properties whose owners kept irregular hours, and he gathered intelligence on his targets before approaching them, walking the streets in daylight, noting the positions of windows, mapping the layout of gardens. He was, by any professional assessment, one of the most skilled burglars working in England at that time. He also maintained 2 households. His legal wife, Hannah, was living under her own name in another part of London. His companion, a woman named Susan Gray, lived with him as Mrs. Ward. He managed this arrangement: 2 women, 2 identities, 1 insurance policy against exposure, for nearly 2 years without either woman betraying him to the authorities. He had also altered his appearance with a thoroughness that bordered on artistry. In Sheffield, Charles Peace was known. A lean, lame man with a pockmarked face, a distinctive way of moving, and fingers mutilated by his old mill injury. In London, John Ward wore a beard, used a rubber compound to pad his cheeks, and carried his arm differently to alter his posture. Police in Sheffield had circulated a description of him after the Dyson murder. Officers in London passed that description daily without connecting it to the genial picture-frame dealer in Peckham. He had read the Victorian world perfectly. A man in a decent house with a pleasant manner was practically invisible. Arthur Dyson was 36 years old when he died on his own doorstep on a cold November night in 1876. He was an American engineer by birth, a practical man who had come to England for work and built himself a modest, solid life in Sheffield's growing industrial suburbs. He and Catherine had a small house in Banner Cross. He had a steady position. He was, by all accounts, a quiet man, the kind of man whose neighbours remember him as decent and unassuming, which is often shorthand for saying he had not yet had occasion to be anything more dramatic than that. What Catherine thought of her life before Peace intruded into it, we cannot fully know. She was a confident, direct woman. That much comes through in her later testimony. She had initially, it seems, found Peace entertaining. He was lively, musical, attentive, and then the attention became something else. It became letters. It became presence on the street outside the house. It became threats. The Dysons moved. Peace followed them. They moved again. Peace appeared on their new street within weeks. Arthur Dyson, caught between a wife being stalked, and a man who had already made clear he would not be stopped by ordinary social discouragement, had few tools available to him. Victorian law offered almost no protection for this situation. There was no injunction to be had, no formal restraining mechanism. You could appeal to a magistrate, you could change your address, and that was more or less the extent of it. On the evening of the 29th of November 1876, Arthur stepped out of his front door. Peace was waiting outside. What was said between them, whether there were words, a confrontation, a moment of recognition, is lost. What is recorded is that Peace fired 3 times. The 3rd bullet hit Arthur Dyson in the head. He died within the hour. PC Nicholas Cock was 23 years old. He had been on the Manchester Constabulary for less than a year. He was working a night beat in Whalley Range in the early hours of the Worcester of August 1876, when he and a colleague encountered a figure moving in the gardens of a property on Brereton Road. The figure ran. Cock pursued. Peace turned and fired. The bullet struck Cock in the chest. He died shortly after. He has no monument. He does not appear in the popular histories of Victorian policing, the way some of his colleagues do. He is, for the purposes of most tellings of the Peace case, a footnote. The first victim, the earlier crime, the murder that was accidentally solved by an innocent man going to prison for it. He was 23 years old, and he was running toward a dark figure in a garden because it was his job to do so. William Habron was 21. He was not dead, but he had lost 3 years of his life to a prison sentence for a murder he had not committed. He was freed in 1880, after Peace's confession. He received a small government compensation payment. History does not record what he made of the rest of his life. For 2 years, Charles Peace was a ghost. Sheffield police had his description. They had Catherine Dyson's testimony. They had neighbours who had seen him on the street outside the Dyson house in the weeks before the murder. They had a wanted notice circulating through the English constabulary. And they had nothing, because Peace was in London, in a beard, in a rented house in Peckham, attending church, and systematically burgling the properties of South London's professional classes. The arrest, when it came, was not the result of brilliant detective work. It was the result of bad luck, or rather, it was the result of Charles Peace's one consistent professional flaw. He could not stop working. On the night of the 10th of October 1878, a police constable named Edward Robinson was walking his beat in Blackheath when he noticed a light moving inside 2 St. John's Park, a large house he knew to be occupied by a family named Brion. He called to a colleague and they approached. A small bearded man came out of the shadows, raised a revolver and fired. The bullet struck Robinson in the arm. Robinson did not stop. He tackled the man. They struggled on the dark lawn. Robinson, despite the wound, held on. The man was taken into custody. He gave his name as John Ward. He said nothing else. The investigation that followed was, by Victorian standards, methodical but slow. John Ward was tried at the Old Bailey in November 1878 for the shooting of P.C. Robinson and sentenced to life imprisonment. This might have been the end of it, a nameless old burglar dying in prison. Except that during the proceedings, one of the warders at Newgate thought there was something familiar about the prisoner's face. He sent a note to Sheffield. A detective named John Bonner came down from Yorkshire and looked at the prisoner through the cell door. He looked for some time, he was certain. The man calling himself John Ward was Charles Peace, wanted for the murder of Arthur Dyson, wanted as the most sought-after burglar in the north of England, believed to have been hiding for 2 years somewhere in the country. He had been in plain sight. In Peckham, in Blackheath, playing violin at dinner parties. Peace was informed that he would be extradited to Sheffield to stand trial for murder. He was placed on a train north under guard. What happened next was reported in every newspaper in England. Somewhere near Kiverton Park in Yorkshire, Peace, handcuffed, 56 years old, with a lame leg, on a train moving at speed, threw himself from the carriage window. He was found on the embankment some miles back, badly injured, but alive. They carried him to the nearest station. They put him on the next train north. He arrived in Sheffield with a broken nose, a fractured cheekbone, and cuts down the left side of his face. He had tried. Even then, even at the very last, he had tried. The trial at Leeds was a formality in the legal sense. Arthur Dyson gave her testimony steadily. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and the jury was out for 12 minutes. But as theatre, it was extraordinary. The public gallery was packed to the rafters every day. Charles Peace, the burglar of a dozen cities, the violinist of Peckham, the man who had let another man go to prison for his crime. He was the most famous criminal in England by the time the verdict was read. The Illustrated Police News had sold out 3 printings. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. He received the news without, according to observers, any visible reaction. Leeds Assizes, February 1879. The courtroom had been designed, as all Victorian courtrooms were, to project the authority of the state. High ceilings, dark wood panelling, the judge elevated on his bench in scarlet robes, the prisoner in the dock below him, like a man at the bottom of a well. The public, packed into the gallery above, leaned over the railings. Peace was smaller in the dock than he seemed in newspaper illustrations. He had lost weight since his arrest. The train escape had left marks on his face. He stood straight, however. He had always, every account agrees, carried himself well. The prosecution case rested principally on Arthur Dyson. She had witnessed her husband's murder. She had seen Peace fire the shots. She had heard him, in the weeks beforehand, make threats. She had moved twice to escape him. Her testimony was direct, composed, and devastating. The defense attempted to suggest that Peace had acted under provocation, that Catherine had encouraged his attentions, that the relationship had been reciprocal, that on the night of the murder something had passed between the 2 men that changed the nature of the act. Arthur Dyson, under cross-examination, did not break. The defense was not helped by the broader picture of Peace's history, his decades of convictions for burglary, his flight from Sheffield, his years of disguise, his attack on P.C. Robinson. None of this could be spoken of directly in the murder trial, but the jury had read the newspapers. They knew who this man was. The jury retired at 3:30 in the afternoon. They returned at 3:45. Guilty. Mr. Justice Lopos, sentencing, told Peace that he had committed a crime of the most deliberate and cold-blooded character, and that the law must take its course. Peace, receiving this, was described by the Leeds Mercury as entirely composed. He was transferred to Armley Gaol to await execution. There, he received the prison chaplain repeatedly, A Reverend J.H. Littlewood, who would later publish a memoir of their conversations, Peace spoke of his crimes. He spoke of his early life. He performed what appeared to be a sincere religious conversion. Whether it was sincere is the question we will return to. On the 23 February 1879, 2 days before his execution, Peace summoned the chaplain and made the confession that history had been waiting for. He admitted to the murder of P.C. Nicholas Cock in Manchester. He admitted that William Habron had been innocent. He stated this clearly, without coercion, without any obvious legal advantage to himself. William Habron was formally pardoned in 1880 and received a compensation payment of £800 from the government, roughly 2 years' wages for a tradesman. He had served 3 years for a murder committed by the small bearded man in the next town, who was, at the time of his trial, hosting dinner parties. The execution on the 25th February proceeded at 8 in the morning. William Marwood, the executioner who had pioneered the long drop method, calculated the drop with professional precision. Peace made a short speech on the scaffold. He declared himself a Christian. He said he forgave his enemies. He asked God's mercy. Then the bolt was drawn. Here is the question that was never answered and never will be. Did Charles Peace genuinely convert? The Reverend Littlewood believed he did. His memoir, published the year after the execution, describes a man in genuine spiritual crisis, tearful, thoughtful, seeking absolution, not from any sense of performance but from what appeared to be real fear of divine judgment. Littlewood was an experienced prison chaplain. He had sat with condemned men before. He wrote that Peace was different, more searching, more honest about his own nature, more apparently moved. There is also this. The confession of the Cock murder served Peace no practical purpose. He was already condemned to death. Confessing to a second murder did not shorten or lengthen his sentence. It did not reduce his suffering. It did not buy him any legal relief. It simply gave William Habron his life back, freed an innocent man, and closed a 3-year injustice. If Peace had said nothing, nobody could have proven otherwise. That is the argument for sincerity. The argument against it is also, in its way, compelling. Charles Peace had been performing his entire life. He had performed the role of respectable neighbour for 2 years, convincingly enough to fool an entire London suburb. He had performed the role of harmless old picture frame dealer, convincingly enough to avoid detection. He had, by all accounts, performed genuine emotion, warmth, charm, affection, on demand, as a professional tool for decades. A deathbed performance of Christian conversion would have been, for a man of his abilities, not difficult. There is also the 45 minutes. Peace's execution was scheduled for 8 in the morning. He arrived on the scaffold at 8 and began a speech. That speech, the declaration of faith, the forgiveness of enemies, the petition to God, lasted, by the accounts of those present, somewhere between 20 and 45 minutes. The executioner Marwood is reported to have grown visibly impatient. The prison governor is said to have had to intervene to bring the proceedings to a close. Was he praying, or was he performing? Or, and this is perhaps the most honest answer, was he doing what he had always done, which was both at once? A man who has lived his entire life in the gap between who he is and who people believe him to be might find at the very end that the gap has closed. He might no longer know himself. He might have played so many people for so long that the self underneath is genuinely unclear. Even to him, the violin playing was real. The grief, when he spoke of it in the chaplain's cell, seems to have been real. The murders were certainly real. What was left of Charles Peace in that moment on the scaffold, we cannot know. The house on Evelina Road, Peckham, was re-let within the month. The new tenants were a solicitor's family from Clapham. They did not know what had happened there. The garden was tidy. The front parlour was clean. The fireplace where John Ward had stood with his violin was simply a fireplace now, cold, ordinary, and quiet. Somewhere in the early 1880s, a copy of Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories began circulating in the kind of respectable household that had once hosted dinner parties for a murderer. In The Adventure of the Bruce Partington Plans, a character, Sherlock Holmes, pauses to remark, in passing, that Charles Peace had been the greatest criminal of the century. It is not a compliment that comes with context. Holmes simply says it, in the way one might state a fact of natural history, and moves on. The schoolteacher, who had written in her diary about the extraordinary musician in Peckham, lived on Evelina Road for another 20 years. She is not recorded as having written about Charles Peace after his arrest. Perhaps the diary simply stopped. Perhaps she chose not to look at it. Some things are easier when you don't look too closely.